order. Welcome to the Women and Equalities Select Committee. Today we have the first of our sessions on egg donation and egg freezing. And we are looking at the practice itself, the standards, the regulations in there, the health implications and the ethics of egg freezing and egg donation. And I am sure it will be an absolutely fascinating session that we have as our first. And we have Mr. Timothy Bracewell-Milnes, consultant gynaecologist and subspecialist in reproductive medicine and surgery at the Lister Fertility Clinic. Welcome. We have Dr. Giulia Cavaliere, lecturer in engaged philosophy at UCL, welcome, and Professor Nicky Hudson, Professor of Medical Sociology at Loughborough University, welcome, and Professor Petra Nordqvist, Senior Lecturer in Sociology and Co-Director of the Morgan Centre for Research into Everyday Lives at the University of Manchester. Thank you very much to you all for being here, and I'm going to pass straight on to Nadia.
Thank you very much. How does the UK regulatory framework differ from other countries, and are there different approaches in devolved nations? Whoever would like to go first, but it would be good to hear from all of you.
Me to start? So the UK is often held up as a world leader in the area of reproductive health and infertility treatment broadly, and I think that's important to highlight. There are differences, and there are some around key areas. So, for example, identification of donor offspring, the number of families that can be conceived from using donor gametes, whether or not donors need to be counselled and how. So there are some really key differences, and I think it's important that we note that the UK has led the field in a lot of these areas. So there are, I would say, some interesting examples globally, and I think the other thing to say about international regulation is that it's specific to each national context, so it's not the case that we can kind of transplant regulations from one context to another. But there are places, for example, where donors and recipients can meet before they engage in donation. So New Zealand, for example, I think that's an interesting case. And places where donors must be counselled before they donate their gametes. That's not the case in the UK. So I think there are countries where we could learn from, but I also think that we do it very well in the UK.
And anything specifically on devolved nations would be interesting to know about.
I think in terms of devolved nations, there's differences in practice. So in Scotland, donors aren't paid. They're not paid anywhere in the UK, but they're not compensated in Scotland. There are differences around funding of fertility treatment generally in the devolved nations, which I think is really important and has a bearing on, for example, whether donors are recruited easily or not.
Thank you.
I think if I could add to that, Nicky, that in terms of payment, how much we pay donors, we differ quite a lot. So obviously payment is not allowed in the UK, but we compensate our donors. And our studies that I have been involved in, together with Dr. Leah Gilman at the University of Manchester, shows that the level of payment that we offer our donors in the UK is kind of meets quite a good level, where people are very much sort of influenced by the social and cultural context in the UK, where donation is very much framed as an altruistic act, and they do it because they feel it's a good thing to do. But they are also compensated for the effort and the travel and maybe losing out on going to work and things like that. So our studies are sort of showing that that's quite a nice, kind of good level, whereas the commercialized practices that we see in the US, where egg donation works very differently and is very, very heavily commercialized, is a very different context to sort of, if we compare internationally. I think on one more issue in terms of international practice, like was mentioned, in terms of identity release that we have in the UK, and we have had since 2005, which means that donors who are recruited after that date go into donation knowing that a donor offspring can contact them at the age of 18. That is sort of becoming something that we need to look at because of DNA testing and because of the way that things are moving on. So in that case, for example, a place like New Zealand has a much more open and flexible framework, and I think it might be something that the UK would benefit from looking at.
Really interesting. Do you have anything to add, Timothy or Giulia?
I mean, yeah, they're the main two major regulatory decisions you make when you're talking about egg donation, is whether you pay the donors or not, and in the UK we don't, and it's, like I said, a compensatory payment, but that's not a motive for a patient to ever do the donation process, and anonymity. So I think it's a very good and open and fair treatment at the moment in the UK.
I have something to add on compensation, but will there be a specific question on that?
There might be.
Yes.
So I can just wait then.
There's a specific section on compensation to donors.
So I'll just hold on.
Not in my section, but I thought that probably would be in someone else's. Okay. To what extent do you think the UK has got it right in terms of regulation, or are there areas where you think there should be changes? Like, for example, do you agree with the regulator that the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act should be revised or amended to include more of a kind of overarching focus on patient protection?
I mean, I think, again, the HFEA Act is held as a benchmark internationally for in terms of regulation. And, I mean, the two major things in terms of egg donation is the counselling aspect, and how that is very much encouraged by all doctors and clinics. So patients will have a very detailed medical assessment. They'll see a counsellor and basically be able to make a very careful decision on whether they go ahead or not, on a very informed decision based on all that information that they're provided before they commit. And the second aspect is vigorous consent. So patients are provided with that verbal and written information and have to consent to literally every aspect of their treatment and what's done in the lab. And that's visited every time they come to the clinic, and it's a very open and transparent process that they can change at any point. It's not at one time point. And then we've talked about the compensatory payment. So patients in countries like the US, where you pay a lot of money for patients to do it, there's a huge risk of exploitation, and obviously that's not an issue in the UK.
Yeah, I think that broadly we've got it right, as I said before, in the UK, but I think there's also an opportunity for horizon scanning around the changes, and Petra's mentioned the increasing use in ancestry testing, for example, as one example of where technology is kind of outpacing the legal context. And when the Act was last amended, that wasn't here, and I think so, you know, the potential for us to look at that alongside questions like whether we've still got it right around informed consent for everybody, I think is a good idea. I also think in the context of egg donation, that it's not necessarily about regulatory changes, but certainly potentially some areas of best practice that we could look at, and that comes out of the research that we've been doing with egg donors in the UK, that there probably are areas where we could make improvements, but that's more about practice, best practice, and less about regulation, perhaps. But I do think I agree with what's been said already about anonymity and identification of donors is moving. The field is moving very quickly, and so we need to look at the law in the context of that change to see if it's still fit for purpose.
Yeah, thanks. So I think to add what has been said, another good thing of the UK is the HFEA as an organization, which to my knowledge, there is no other country that has a similar apparatus on top of the Act. In terms of like changes, so the sort of like licensing, inspecting clinics, setting standards, and the code of practice of the HFEA is excellent in my view. I think in terms of changes to the Act, I don't have much to suggest, whereas at the level of, so this is building on what Nicky was saying in terms of like keeping up with societal and technological changes. And for example, the fact that people postpone more and more the time of conception and the phenomenon of reproductive aging, so the fact that people have children later in life, obviously is going to affect both generally the use of fertility treatments like IVF, but also maybe an increased use or increased need for donors if women have children later in life. So whilst this is not covered by the Act, is important that the policy sort of landscape is attuned to these societal changes.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. I think something that comes out really clearly in the qualitative studies that we've done with egg donors, which are aiming at understanding their experiences in depth as opposed to sort of surface mapping donors' experiences, is that many egg donors understand egg donation as quite a personalised gift that puts them in connection with their recipient. Be that an anonymous connection, but it is nevertheless often felt to be something that connects them with that person. And that comes through particularly strongly amongst egg sharers, who often conceive, if both women are successful, they conceive very closely, you know, the day after each other or so. So there is a sense of connection there. And although some egg donors that we spoke to are want to maintain anonymous, they don't sense that connection, but others feel that very strongly, and they must go down the known donor route. Now, at the moment, we don't support known donation in clinics. Even though it's not illegal, but it's not something that clinics support. And I think a more flexible framework would target more what women actually want, whereas some maybe do want to remain anonymous. Others are actually really keen to connect in some way or open to some form of connection. So I think that's something that could be looked at and would benefit egg donors. Thank you.
Really, really interesting. Thank you. And what has the impact been of unregulated fertility services, for example, online fertility treatments, on the safety and well-being of patients?
So I'm just going to start. So when you say online fertility, is it like fertility testing or is it something else?
I think just kind of the quite wide array of services that are available online that aren't necessarily regulated.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
So like in a general sense.
Okay, thanks. So I'm just going to say a few words about this, but maybe then everyone else can jump in. So I think one of the things that have changed the most in the last few years is the availability online of what sometimes is called fertility testing or fertility screening, which is basically companies trying to, companies that offer as a service the sort of like checking blood tests and the hormonal level and ovarian reserve and so on. But I think a problem with that is that they are sold as, or they are marketed as sort of assessing fertility, but what they actually do is just assessing hormone levels and ovarian reserve, which doesn't say much about the actual chances of pregnancy. And so, I mean, there are lots of other things that I think my colleagues are better suited to speak about, such as like ancestry testing and so on. But I find this an area that is quite concerning because the NHS doesn't offer blood tests or tests for ovarian reserves and the anti-Mullerian hormone, which indicates sort of like broad fertility ability to have children, but it's very loosely connected to the actual ability to have children. So the NHS doesn't offer us unless there is a diagnosis of infertility or there has been an ongoing investigation. And therefore, also connected to the fact that people have children later in life, there's been a growing use of this kind of testing, which I think it's quite concerning because then you get lots of women who might be worried for no reasons, and then they don't have any outlet in which they could seek help because they might not be trying to conceive at that moment, so there is no cure for like potential future infertility. So I think that's one area.
Thank you. There's also one very specific example, I think, on this front, where we saw Apricity, which was a concierge service as well, which is online, and when that shut down, there were people left without any kind of support and communication directly with the fertility providers as well. Is there anything that you would like to see, because they fell out of scope of any of the protections because they weren't actually providing any fertility treatment themselves? They were just like a gateway, I guess, for people. Is there anything that you have feelings on that, or any kind of whether that's a responsible way to be doing things.
I mean, the whole concept of that, which is now shut down, was for patient convenience. So the patients who were going there were paying for that service, so they could, if they wanted to go somewhere for a scan one day and then somewhere else for a scan another day, they could do that. Very few patients chose that. Most prefer to be in a clinic, know the team, know the nurses, know their consultant. But yeah, it was an unfortunate example, but because they weren't actually responsible for the decisions and the care themselves, it would obviously be something that's quite difficult to legislate against, I think.
I think it is a signal of where the kind of field is moving, though, as well. I think, and I think it raises the question of what need that's fulfilling that falls outside. And we know, obviously, that most fertility treatment is funded by patients themselves. Most of it isn't funded by the NHS, and so patients are looking for efficient ways to access treatment. And obviously, the world is moving to an online model, so I think it is attractive. The kind of platformisation of IVF generally. And I think we do need to think about what safeguarding around the potential for that. And I think that's where some of the push to look at the regulation in the context of patient safety is moving, because it's moving into a new space. Fertility medicine is one of the most regulated areas of treatment, but it's also one of the most commercialised areas of medicine. And so I think, and it's not just the kind of concierge services in IVF, but there are also concierge services in egg donation as well. So we've got quite a lot of egg agencies in the UK, but also across Europe and internationally, which I think is very relevant for this committee in terms of the implications for the egg donors that might be engaging with those services as well as the recipients, because some of that work does fall outside, of course, of the regulatory context of the UK, because they're not based in the UK. So I think it is it's difficult, because how do we regulate for those sorts of commercial organisations that don't fall into the HFE Act? But I think it is important that part of that is about, it's probably beyond the scope of this committee, but is about how we fund fertility treatment in the UK, and it's also about how we give information to patients.
Thank you. You said that they're paid for services. Do you know roughly how much that they would cost an individual? Are they expensive or?
I don't think they're cheap. No, I think in terms of egg agencies, a package would potentially be maybe £3,000 to £5,000, and for recipients to be matched with a donor and to be kind of supported through that process. General concierge IVF services, I don't know how much they charge.
Just to say that on the back of that, because of the price tag attached to IVF and private reproductive medicine in this country, there is a growth in people who use online social media and digitalised platforms to find donors, because they simply cannot afford to go via established clinics. So that is, that's part of the system of how the whole field looks.
Thank you. Sorry, Nadia.
No, thank you. Just final question from me. Are the safety standards and limits on stimulation cycles aligned with current evidence?
In terms of the complications from an IVF cycle?
Yeah.
I mean, a cycle of IVF is a lot for a patient to go through. It's invasive and inconvenient. You have to come in for 4 or 5 scans, and then invasive transvaginal procedure to collect eggs, and then depending on the treatment, an embryo transfer as well. Having said that, it's extremely safe, with very, very few complications. And I mean, the common ones are just the physical effects like bloating and a bit of abdominal pain, and the hormonal effects that almost all women report. But serious complications like ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome numbers have really plummeted over the last 10 to 15 years with the advent of something called the agonist trigger and a freeze-all approach if the response is high. So the levels of a significant OHSS are now well below 1%, which is a very good standard and very much in line or much better than other countries. and then in terms of long-term safety, again, very, very high number of high patient cohort studies and numerous meta-analyses showing no long-term effects in terms of female cancers and other long-term morbidities. So it seems like a very safe treatment that we're offering.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nadia. Rebecca?
Thank you. I just want to move on to advertising, which I think, following on from some of the discussion we've just had around the financials, emphasises how important the advertising oversight to make sure that the balance is right in terms of providing a service that people want and not moving into exploitation. Because obviously, some of these girls have been paid £985, and then someone is doing egg matching for £3,000, £4,000. That's a lot of money being made, and some of these girls could potentially be vulnerable. But my question is, do you think there is sufficient oversight of advertising and marketing of these activities in light of that delicate balance that we need to reach here? To whoever wants to answer it.
Yeah, I think I'll have a go at that one. There is a great deal of regulation in this area for fertility medicine, again, in relationship to advertising. The Competition and Markets Authority have provided some guidance for clinics on this, and that kind of came about because of the debates about fertility add-ons that we had a few years ago, and whether clinics were marketing fertility add-ons in an accurate and responsible way. And this area of recruitment of donors falls within that scope as well. And I think there are signs that is starting to work. I think we did, as part of our research on egg donation, we looked at the UK, Spain and Belgium, 3 countries where egg donation happens, and we looked at recruitment of donors through clinic fertility websites. So we didn't look at the kind of social media advertising, we looked at websites. And what we found was that there are areas for improvement around not necessarily the compensation levels, but around the ways risks are communicated to potential donors. And partly that's because we have so little evidence about the long-term risks for egg donors. And so it is a gap, and I think one of the things that we need to think about recommendations around is more research and funding for more research around this. And so in the absence of information about long-term risks, clinics kind of provide sort of ambiguous, at least in the analysis that we did of those 3 countries, can provide kind of ambiguous information. And perhaps don't give donors enough information about some of the more practical short-term risks that Tim's mentioned. So I think there's still some work that we could be done around that. But I think the kind of moral panic, should we say, that we've had around advertising potentially is a little bit misplaced in my view. We didn't find horror stories, should I say, in relationship to recruitment of donors through those sorts of adverts.
You said that you just looked at websites, you didn't look at social media.
Yeah.
So the stories that I've heard, which actually prompted me to raise this with the committee and want to do this inquiry, is that I've had young women say to me that it's all over their social media. And I was really confused. I was like, oh my goodness, I don't see any of this. Is that true? And then I realised I'm too old. I'm too old. I'm in my late 40s. You don't want my eggs. But so I'm hearing this from young women. Often, they're at university or at school. They've not. We all know what it's like for young people at the moment. It's very, very difficult, and that gives me quite a lot of cause for concern. You say you think it's a moral panic. But I do think it would be really good to get your input from all of you on this, because I think I am concerned that we're potentially targeting young women that, as you've said, we don't understand the health impacts, the long-term impact. There is a risk. And that's, do they understand that? They're potentially likely to take something for short-term financial gain if they need to pay the rent. And then there's all the other psychological side to this when potentially there's a child at the end of it. So it'd be good to get your perspective.
Can I go? Yeah. So I understand the concern, and I've also been targeted in the past. So I also saw these ads. They were all over my social media. So I have sort of three thoughts. So the first one is I checked the sort of Competition and Markets Authority last review, which was done in 2022. And it was actually, like, the results were generally positive in terms of not breaching the sort of standards set for advertising. And the main problem was pricing and success rates. The certain clinics were not so transparent, especially for egg freezing. But the CMA wrote to these clinics and the change have been implemented. So I think in terms of like the mechanism, there are some mechanisms in place that work really well. So this is the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that I totally understand the concern about young women being targeted. But then there are two things that are relevant to this. So the first one is if you want egg donors, they need to be young women. So there is obviously this tension whereby, of course, they might be more vulnerable than a 30-something-year-old with a permanent job. At the same time, the 30-something woman with a permanent job has lower one-year reserve, so like anyway wouldn't be a very good, could be still a good candidate, but not excellent candidate. So there is this tension where I think is a bit also the nature of the process that requires not like aggressive targeting, but requires recruitment of young women. I also want to say, because I saw this in the evidence and I was quite disturbed by this, that there was a submission that said that the brain of young people is not developed until 25, which, I mean, I know the study that the evidence was, but it means that the brain plasticity continues to develop past the age of 18. It doesn't mean that people below 25 are unable to decide for themselves. So I'm not sure about maybe moral panic, like I kind of actually agree, but aside from moral panic, I think there is an issue of considering young women not being able to decide in this respect, whereas we let them decide in many other respects. So in a sense, like, I don't know, studying philosophy like I did, it's a much bolder choice than donate your eggs in some ways if you think of long-term effect. I know that people disagree. I know, I mean, I don't know. But like, no, I mean, fine, you disagree. I still think so. I wasn't just making a joke. In the sense that the long-term effect of egg donation, there are no specific study on that, but IVF has been practiced since 1978 and is exactly the same process. So even if there are no specific studies on that, there is a lot of evidence of the long-term effects of ovarian stimulation and all these things. So this is one thing. And the other thing that I totally understand the concern about sort of exploitation and exploiting vulnerability, but I also worry when we go too much on the other side and we don't consider women to be able to make decisions for themselves. And so I think it's a balance, and that's why I was saying the thing about philosophy, that young women make lots of choices that affect them long term, and I don't want this to be picked as the most significant one ever, that they are, and additionally one that they are not able to do for themselves. So, and this is not me not sharing the concern, I just want to fine-tune the sort of narrative around it, if that's okay.
No, it's very helpful, and this is the whole point of this. We want to hear all the different views. That's exactly the point of this. Would anyone else like to answer? If
you look at numbers in our clinic, the number of percentage of our egg donors under the age of 25 is about 17%. So it's the vast majority of between 30 and 35 years of age. That's number one. Number two is, if I flip it the other way, advertising is really important for women to be able to make a choice in their treatment. And certainly our research that we conducted for egg sharing, which is a process where a patient's wanting to have a baby but also giving away a proportion of her eggs during her treatment. There was huge frustration amongst patients who eventually came to us for that treatment, that the average time before coming to us was about 3.5 years, because they just didn't know about it as an option to them. And that could actually deny them treatment, because obviously you've got a cut-off of age 36, and if they find out about it when they're 37 but they've been trying for a baby for 4 years and they can't afford IVF privately, then advertising is important as well.
I think Nicky and Petra wanted to come in on this.
Thank you. I think, I would agree that research would always be welcome and to explore how young women particularly experience egg donation. But I think the evidence that is there is partly saying that the egg donors, egg donors don't go to egg donation for the money. They live in a society where egg donation is very much conceptualized as an altruistic act. And the egg donors that have been part of my studies and our studies are sort of, it's something they're really proud of. you know,
studies. I think it would be helpful.
Sorry?
Could we see those studies? That would just be helpful for our
Absolutely,
evidence.
yeah, they are in the public domain.
Oh, great.
And they, you know, they come to egg donation as a good thing to do, and they talk about it as a good thing that happened, and it's something they're really proud of. And so, and some, you know, even the comment that they are doing it for the money is like an insult, because that's not why they're there. So, that's just kind of the context for the majority of egg donors that we have evidence about are not there. You know, they are not that category of vulnerable women, and there is no evidence, as far as I'm aware, that it attracts vulnerable women, and certainly. The age bracket that we see from the HFEA is that the average age of women is 31, 32 years old of egg donors. So so that, I think that's the kind of the picture of the experiences of egg donor that is coming through research.
Nicky?
Yeah, and I think from speaking to prospective donors as well, so we've got quite a lot of research around from public surveys that show that when people are asked would they consider egg donation, they don't know that it's an option. So I think the fact that people are surprised when they do receive the kind of social media adverts shows that actually we're not doing a very good job at raising awareness more generally about the need for egg and sperm donors. And part of the answer to that question is that we no longer have a national charity or organisation that is tasked with the kind of awareness raising we did historically, and sadly they folded. So that work falls to clinics and agencies and so on, and we don't have that kind of nationally coordinated campaign that we see in other countries that raise, a bit like the campaigns that we have around blood donation, so on, that we don't have that. And perhaps if we had that, we wouldn't need so much of that kind of targeted Facebook kind of advertising, or when people do receive it, it wouldn't be so much of a surprise to them that and they wouldn't feel targeted in the way that sometimes we do when we receive these kind of social media adverts. And I think just to pick up on the points that have been made about the average age of egg donors, I think my experience of working with clinics over a really long period of time is that they take very seriously the care and ethics around the management of egg donors and the counselling of egg donors. And if they had concerns about somebody being particularly vulnerable, my experience is that they would investigate that and they would take it very seriously. Of course, that's not going to be uniform all the time, but I think I've worked in this field for 25 years and I don't work in a clinic, but I work very closely with clinics. And the kind of counselling and screening of donors is taken very seriously. So it'd be those younger women where people were perhaps concerned that, it was somebody who was just doing it because they want to pay the rent and hadn't thought about the long-term implications, particularly in a context where they could be contacted by a donor-conceived person in the future. That would be discussed very carefully with them in a kind of counselling setting. So it doesn't come out, I think, of our research and our work that there are huge numbers of extremely young, vulnerable women that are kind of moving into egg donation.
Thank you. You got one more?
No.
Okay.
I've had plenty of time, so thank you. Chair. Thank you.
I just wanted to come back on a couple of Rebecca's points there. Petra and Nicky, I don't think any of us are sat here thinking the majority of people are just, they're not doing this for altruistic reasons, or that a lot of people aren't doing it for altruistic reasons. We know that it's actually quite invasive, although you've said it's safe. The Advertising Standards Authority did write to us ahead of this committee to say that they had taken the decision to ban 2 paid Facebook ads for Egg Donors UK. Now, when you read the example of this advert, it is very much targeting in a way that had put the financial compensation front and centre. It was in large bold text in bright pink colour, and all the rest of the text was very muted. Then the pictures and the images that accompanied this advert were people 3 women going out for a party, basically in a celebratory kind of after receiving the payment. Now, if commercial entities are targeting in that way and advertising in that way, they would have done focus research. They would have seen whether they wouldn't have spent money on an advert like this if they didn't think there was a market for it. I think at the moment, what you're seeing and what you're telling us is not necessarily what we may have in the future if we continue to go down the road that we're going down. And it is great that the ASA did stop that, but there will probably be examples where we haven't stopped that, or it has reached out in a space that the ASA aren't actually able to block. Are there concerns that we would move to that, and that there are that commercialisation of it where they are fulfilling a need that the NHS is not? Is there a concern around the strength of regulations that we have around the advertising side of it and commercialisation of it? Nicky?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that shows that we are moving into a new space, and that also the regulation around this area is working, but they might have a bigger job down the line. I think part of the answer to that question relates to the emergence of agencies that aren't necessarily linked to a licensed clinic. And also the emergence of egg banks, and we're seeing that increasingly in the European context. It's something in our research that we saw a lot of in Spain, commercial egg banks which are shipping eggs around Europe and internationally, and potentially are approaching this in a very different way to clinics because their business model is entirely different to a fertility clinic. And that is growing for sure. And we do have examples of commercial egg banks in Europe, and the potential for that to happen in the UK as well. At the moment, we don't have any standalone commercial egg banks in the UK. We have clinics that have their own frozen egg banks, and that's because the freezing of eggs has become so successful that they're able to freeze, and that clinics are using those for their own internal purposes. But we know from the Spanish context that clinics are potentially making that move into the development of standalone commercial egg banks because they've got an in-house egg bank, and it makes commercial sense for that to be the next logical step. There's nothing to say that won't happen in the UK. And our research with donors, we spoke to donors about that, and they hated the idea, frankly. And so I think donors aren't always aware of the shift in the marketplace. And I think that's something that, again, we need better counselling and information giving of donors because they see those ads. And I don't necessarily, again, I agree with Petra that if somebody's going to donate their eggs, they're going to do it anyway. And an advert like that might tip them into, or there's somebody who's advertising here, that speaks to me and it's something I want to do. It's so invasive and time consuming that most people, if they were going to do it for £985, the vast majority hear what's involved, and then if they weren't committed to the process, would kind of step aside at that point. But those kind of marketing kind of commercial practices are a sign, I think, of the way things could be heading. Again, I kind of go back to the fact that in the UK we don't have a fully commercial model, and we have got very good regulation, but I think we need to be aware of it. I think it would be a mistake to think, oh, our regulation's great, we don't need to worry about this. It's a minor. We know from our research that it is moving in a more commercial way in the UK.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I'm going to hand over to Nia now.
Thank you very much. And I was going to touch on the topic of compensation, which you've already mentioned several times, but I think Dr. Giulia in particular wanted to add a bit. So with my first question, if there is something that we want to add to what we've already said, then please do so. It's just a very general question about the extent to which the compensation involved does actually incentivise women, and have we got the right model here in the UK?
Yeah, thanks. I'll start, and then thanks for the question. So it seems the available evidence, which I re-reviewed in preparation to this meeting, seems that women don't do it for the money, in the sense that either they don't cite at all financial reasons, or, as Petra was saying, they explicitly reject the idea that they are doing it for the money. Obviously, there might be people that are not captured in this research that might be doing for the money. That said, so two things about compensation. So the first one is, so the UK, so actually England and Wales recently switched from, or not recently, but switched from the sort of like reimbursement model where receipts were handed in and the donors could get the money back from all the travels and loss of work and whatever they had to do, to a sort of flat rate as a sort of compensation model that is not payment. So personally, I think this is a change in the right direction. The reason being that, we all submitted expenses. It's a long, prolonged annoying process, and in a sense the process is already burdensome in itself, so I think this model is better suited for donors. In terms of the change from 785, I think, I don't remember, from 750 to 985, the HFEA explicitly states that is in line with the cost of living and inflation. So I know there were concerns in terms of, oh, we raise compensation, we're going to raise it again, but prices have changed, prices of things have changed a lot in the last few years, so I think that's also justified. Now, in terms of more like the sort of ethics of it, so I understand the worry that was also raised before about women doing it for the money and also exploiting vulnerability. At the same time, £900 for going through all these is really not a lot. And so in a sense, like, I don't know, getting a job in a pub, it's maybe less burdensome and you get more money. So I think it's always need to be compared against other things that people might do to get the same amount of money, and then it's not a lot of money considering what it's involved. This is the first thing. And the second thing, and then I'll stop, is that it is like very burdensome in some ways and very invasive and requires a lot of time, commitment. You need to go to appointments. I mean, as probably everyone knows here, I've been through that because I did egg freezing. It was in the evidence, so I'm happy to speak about this. But it's basically like a full-time thing for a few months. And so I think it's also good to consider it in some ways work that people do, even if we should be paid for the work we do. This is not payment, it's compensation. But it requires quite a lot of involvement and effort. And so I think it would be unfair towards the donors to not recognize this, because I think it fits into this narrative of women just like doing it because they are women and that's their role in reproduction, which I think is also a really bad model. So I think this idea of like, it's still altruistic, but we recognize the burdens associated with doing it, I think is a very good way of doing it.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely, and that really comes through in our research with egg donors, that in real, even though like as a culture we might think of pure altruism as something that kind of exists, but in real life, sort of an other directed gift can also sit quite nicely with self-interest, and there isn't a huge contradiction as we go about living our everyday lives, as maybe culturally we think there are. So the donors that we interviewed, for example, who egg share, they might both think, oh, this is great, because it means I can actually afford IVF and have the number of children or the child that I want, and I can do something good for someone else. So it wasn't like a contradiction for them. The other thing to say, I think, is that since the introduction of identity release donation in 2005, the donors that are recruited are also made very aware that a child may well contact them in the future. And many of the donors we spoke to felt like if they had done it for the money, that would be a really hard story to tell to that child when they contact them. So actually that framework was sort of, again, it was kind of cementing that feeling that I'm not here for the money and that it wouldn't be right if I was. So I think there is a very high degree of awareness that this child who may be conceived actually may come along and contact me. And then and there was a very, very strong moral story about if that happens, then that child will need to be in the lead of that relationship, and I'm not going to impose myself on that child. So, there is a very much understood, egg donation is understood in that frame.
Yeah. Could I just ask a couple of sort of follow-up questions? So, clearly a woman who is going to share, her primary motivation is either to have a baby or to freeze her eggs. But is there a temptation for the price of the IVF to be inflated in order to make women more likely to want to take advantage of the discount for having shared their eggs?
It's not something I've come across in the research, so I don't have evidence to sort of to say that that's true. You might be better placed to answer that.
I mean, if you look at self-funding patients and how many fertility clinics there are in London, if you, as a clinic, sky up your prices, then patients will just go to another clinic.
So actually this is like very much connected to my research, which is we consider more the price of IVF and egg freezing. So while it might be that there is a case that it gets inflated, but I agree that the sort of competition model, unfortunately, in this case helps because you could just go to another clinic. At the same time, the vast majority of patients that go through IVF in the UK go through privately funded treatment. So So considering that for some people it's quite costly and sometimes they are not able to afford IVF or egg freezing, there is this thing whereby you have an incentive to do egg sharing just because already the price is quite prohibitive. Because so one cycle of IVF, it's about £5,000, but one cycle is very often not enough. So usually people go through multiple cycles. Same with egg freezing is around that price cap, maybe a bit lower depending on the clinic. But so there is an incentive to share already because the funding for IVF is so poor that people tend to go privately. So I think it might not be a concern moving forward in terms of inflated prices, but it's already a worry that actually I don't think should be tackled by reducing the amount of people who donate, but should be tackled by increasing the funding for IVF and egg freezing. So obviously this is beyond the scope of this, but I think, yeah, that's an important thing.
Thank you. And just to check up, are there any other pressures, or do you think those are the main pressures that might affect women's decisions in terms of what you've already covered?
I think for me, so there are two, like the financial aspect is the biggest because, as I said before, it goes with people have children later in life, so they struggle more and more to conceive, therefore IVF becomes more popular, and egg freezing, as we have seen in the last few years. The second, obviously, is more about the sort of social context in which these choices are made. So there is still a big push for women to have children, and still like having children considered the gold standard of a kind of life one could have. So, but that's not something that can be easily addressed to legislation. But I think it's important to keep it in mind as the context in which these choices are made, even if the pressure is sort of like very loose and non-direct, is still there.
Thank you very much, Nia. Rachel.
Thank you. I think you've already touched on a little bit of what I was going to ask about in terms of the age demographic of most donors. But what else do we know about the demographics of donors in terms of their income, ethnicity, education? So perhaps Nicky, you could.
Yeah. So in terms of ethnicity, there's a long-standing shortage in the UK of donors from minority ethnic communities. That's something that I've done research on historically, and that picture hasn't changed a great deal. That shortage persists, and I think it's partly related to what I mentioned earlier in terms of the lack of this is where advertising, increased and improved advertising could really help. So research that we did quite a few years ago now looking at British South Asian communities, people weren't aware of the need for donors. And so there are a range of reasons for shortages around ethnicity, and it's partly about awareness, it's partly sometimes about cultural and religious barriers to donation, it's partly because people don't discuss infertility so much in certain communities. And so ethnicity is a big marker of difference around donor profiles that we see, that we do still have shortages. In terms of income, I think the data from the HFEA, the latest data from the HFEA, show that egg donors are no less likely or no more likely to be represented in kind of more deprived areas. They're kind of average in terms of socioeconomic status. And in terms of parenthood status, donors in the UK, about a third of donors are likely to have their own children. That has reduced. It used to be that women were more likely to have their own children than that, and now we see more women without children donating. I think part of the answer to that is that people are having children later, and clinics are recruiting in different ways. So yeah, it's a mixed picture. I think we've covered age already. I don't know.
Thanks. I mean, Petra, is there anything else you want to add in terms of sort of class or educational background of donors?
It hasn't been something that has sort of stood out in terms of the studies that I've done. As I said, women tend not to be motivated by money. In qualitative studies, you have quite a small sample, so it's not a big representative. So it doesn't tell us about overall egg donors in the UK. What does that population look like?
So there's no particular evidence of there being targeting of higher education students as opposed to young women who might be sort of working in the local pub or anything.
I mean, I think what we know about women who go into egg donation through egg sharing is that they already have the resource to consider privately paid for IVF. So you're already talking about a demographic that have resource, even though it might not be quite enough to pay for IVF treatment. So as far as I'm aware, there is no evidence to suggest that more vulnerable groups of women are being targeted.
Okay. Is there any evidence about what motivates different demographics of donors to donate?
Well, egg share patients are motivated more by financial gain compared to a standard egg donation patient because they're getting access to treatment that is frankly very expensive. But from our research looking into egg sharers, the financial motives were lower down than altruistic motives because don't forget the majority of egg sharers are infertile and been going through that struggle for a few years, and so therefore they've got great empathy and really like the fact that I've got good egg reserve, good number of eggs, I can help another couple to have another family. So those altruistic motives for egg donors were still very, very important.
And any research been done on the sexual orientation of egg donors? I think we know that. Okay.
A significant minority of our patients are in same-sex couples, and again, when we've done interviews with them and survey data, they needed donor sperm so therefore they want to help in that similar way.
Thank you.
Similarly, we have data where people feel they want to give back. So if they have been recipients of donor sperm, many of them want to sort of give something back to the community.
Yeah. Okay.
Just to add, I think this is an area where there isn't much research. We don't have a lot of evidence about different cohorts of donors generally at a large scale.
Is that something that we should be looking at? Yeah,
definitely.
Touching back on what Nicky was talking about, ethnicity, that's a big problem that we have, and certainly in our clinic, 85% of our egg donors, whether they're egg sharers or altruistic donors, are Caucasian. And if you think about it from the other side of the women who need these eggs of ethnic minorities, they often will want to match physical characteristics, and if we can't provide them with those choices, it drives them abroad to less regulated clinics potentially.
Sorry, just building on that, just very quickly this time. So I checked, and only 3% of the eggs used for egg donation are imported from abroad, and the main reason is this ethnicity matching, so the fact that we don't have enough eggs for it. So it's quite interesting because it's a very, very low number, but it's very specific because it's exactly about this. So.
Okay.
There's two real big differences with getting eggs from abroad. So if we, as a UK clinic, have a license with an egg bank abroad, all of those eggs are under HFEA regulations. So those women who donated weren't paid more than the £985. They did all the same consent forms, all the same blood screening. Whereas cross-border reproductive care, where a patient takes themselves off to another clinic and goes to another egg bank, they're completely outside of any UK legislation. So there's two very different patient groups getting eggs from abroad.
That's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. But it's worth probably noting that £985 in another country and in some countries will be a huge amount of money. David.
Thank you. Firstly, I'm finding this fascinating. It's an area I know very little about, so thank you all for your contributions. I've got another question just to follow on shortly, but just to continue that topic of eggs from abroad. Maybe for you, Nicky, is there sufficient oversight to ensure that eggs imported from abroad are ethically sourced? And what are the risks of importing and exporting donor eggs?
Yes, hopefully the regulatory system works in the way that Tim's just described, in that if clinics in the UK are importing eggs from an overseas clinic or egg bank, that they have to demonstrate quite clearly that they fulfil the HFEA criteria. And I think we can probably assume that clinics take that quite seriously, because a breach in this regard would risk them having their licence revoked. So I think we do have pretty stringent regulation around import. And again, as Giulia's just pointed out, the numbers of eggs that are being imported currently are quite low and generally specifically targeted for certain patients. I think one of the areas that's come up in our research has been around the limits on the use of donors. And some of you might have been aware of the documentaries that have been aired recently on Netflix around the sperm donors with hundreds and hundreds of children. Yeah. We're not in that territory yet for egg donors, but because we don't have global limits on how many families egg and sperm donors can conceive, we could potentially be moving into a territory certainly where egg donors, where their eggs are being exported from the UK because they've met the family limit in the UK, could potentially be creating more than 10 families. And that's true of donors being imported as well. So we do currently have a strong need for regulation in the area of global limits on egg and sperm donors. At the moment, that really is critical in the context of sperm donors because they can donate again and again and create hundreds and hundreds of families. Egg donors aren't quite in that landscape, but we know, for example, in Spain, some of the donors that donate to egg banks in Spain, the numbers of eggs that are retrieved per cycle are around an average of 19 eggs per cycle. The registries in Spain aren't as thorough as they are here, so there's potential for donors to move around and donate multiple times. So it's not unfeasible that we could be in a situation where we have multiple children being born from egg donors, and we don't really have a cultural script for that. We have a kind of narrative around a family where there are lots of children born from one man but not from one woman. So I think it's another area where we're not there at the moment, but the import-export question raises really interesting questions now that eggs can be frozen successfully and shipped. Yes. And it's somewhere I think the regulation needs to look, because we don't currently have that situation, but we could do feasibly. So I think we're currently okay, but it might be an area where we want to kind of keep a watching brief on what's happening, both in terms of the import of eggs and how closely that is monitored, but certainly the export of eggs.
Would anyone like to address maybe how those concerns could be addressed longer term? I mean, clearly, as you said, it's not a big concern at the moment, but it could become. So what measures could we put in place to prevent it becoming a concern? Petra, maybe you.
Not sort of. It's not something I've looked into in terms of my research, but it is my understanding that UK clinics, a donor who donates in the UK can only give rise to 10 families, yes, and the number of children within the limit of 10 families. But there's nothing stopping their egg or sperm to then be exported. So that is the sort of thing where possibly we could stop that from happening through UK-based regulation. Yeah. That is something that comes to mind.
It's the only thing that I can think of is in preventing the egg banks from exporting to multiple countries, because once it's gone out of your country, then it's that country's legislation. There's nothing you can do about it.
I think we need international cooperation, which is notoriously difficult, isn't it? So I think, we have to look at that from a national perspective first, and then think about how we coordinate with other countries.
Thank you. I just have one final question with the Chair's permission. I'm just trying to understand something for myself. So we've heard about the demographics of people likely to donate. We've heard about compensation. We're not calling it payment, it's a compensation. Can you just explain to me the actual time commitment to be an egg donor? What does that look like? Maybe Timothy or Giulia, if you just explain the actual process, the time commitment required.
So what would happen would be that the donor would book an appointment and have an initial thorough consultation to go through their medical history. They'd have tests to make sure they're suitable from an egg reserve point of view, an AMH and an ultrasound scan, and they'd have that assessment. And then the doctor would make a decision, a welfare decision as well, based on that donor. Like Nicky's touched on, if we have any concerns about that donor not, vulnerability or not being suitable, then we would flag it at that stage and not put them further down the process. And then once they're okayed for treatment, as an egg donor, they would have some screening bloods, which tend to take about 6 weeks or so to get the results of back. And then in terms of the actual treatment itself, again, part of okaying them for the treatment would be a thorough counselling session where the counsellor would explore all of the issues surrounding egg donation that we've talked about today in terms of the donor anonymity, what the process goes through, the emotional things to think about that potential future contact. And then in terms of the actual treatment process itself, what it involves is giving some injections to stimulate the ovaries to produce multiple follicles. And when you're doing that treatment, you need to regularly monitor the patients. So they do those injections themselves at home, but then come in for regular ultrasound scans to the clinic. So it tends to be 4 to 5 scans that they have to come in for. And the amount of time the injections is approximately 2 weeks, so about 12 days on average. And the egg collection procedure then is 2 days later. So from active treatment, it's about 2 weeks from start of injections to egg collection. The egg collection is the most invasive part of the process. Patients usually, most clinics would put the patient to sleep, so a low-dose anaesthetic, and it's done transvaginally, where you puncture through the vagina, looking what you're doing on scan, straight into the middle of the follicle and drain all the fluid from them. So the procedure is very much day case, and the patient will be in hospital or in the clinic for about 2 to 3 hours on average, and then that's the end of their process.
That's really useful. I guess the reason I was asking, my concern, obviously the data we've seen suggests that it's the most deprived demographics that have a higher percentage that are likely to donate eggs. So whilst that seems like quite an intensive procedure, and you're right, if I'm short of money, should I be concerned that somebody may be doing this to support their income? And do you have proper procedures in place to make sure, I mean, you can't prevent people doing it to support their income, but, what's in place to I guess, protect people from going through quite an invasive and long procedure just to support their income?
Well, I mean, I understand what you're saying, and it may be a part of the motivation for certain patients to do it, but there's no evidence that it's the driving force whatsoever. There's just no evidence out there for that when you compare it to commercial donation, where it's the number one factor, and therefore those women are at risk of exploitation. I mean, giving an egg, I've just described the process, what it involves. And look at it from the other side, I think it's really unfair. Why should a woman put herself through that to try and help someone and be out of pocket from doing it? Yes. Think about how expensive a train fare. A lot of these women live a long way from the clinic. By the time they've commuted to the clinic, had the scan, seen the nurse, had left, they're probably off work for 2 or 3 hours at least. And so, I mean, from our research, actually surveying the UK population, for example, of about 1,000 patients that we surveyed, over 90% were in favour of a compensatory payment. And when they were told, admittedly at this point, it was £750, the majority of respondents felt that wasn't sufficient to say. It's an imperfect world where, unfortunately, it's very difficult for a woman to donate their eggs compared to donating sperm. But I think it's been very carefully thought through by the HFEA in terms of coming up with that figure. And I think it's a compensatory payment, not a commercial payment, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Rebecca, you had just one short question.
A really quick question. So the £985, though, that's a flat amount that they automatically get given. So they don't have to come with expenses, do they? And say these
traditionally, we did that, but then it was so complained about, and then I haven't got the receipt for that journey, and it just wasn't really, became a bit of just a nightmare. So it's changed now.
Yeah, it recently changed. Before it was a submit receive model. But I think it's quite sound, the reasoning behind this is a sort of like, we know how much more or less people would have to give up in terms of work, traveling, and so this is how it was calculated. But I honestly think that, I know it's more worrying, but at the same time, I think it's already quite a heavily admin-intensive process, and I think adding this, it's a bit unfair to donors. So the sort of I need to keep track on everything, I need to talk to my employer, so I think there are reasons to transfer to this flat rate model, so long as we are okay with the number, I guess.
Thank you. Petra wanted to come in, and then I have a question about the international element.
It was just about your comment about time, and I think it's really important. Obviously, egg donors in the UK donate under identity release, like I've already said. And I think something to keep in mind in terms of time isn't just the time at the clinic that Tim described really eloquently, but the time going forward that it may well come in. So one of the things that our egg donors, as I said before, many go into egg donation and actually experience quite a sense of commitment, but also connection, particularly with the recipient parents. But what they never will know if is someone actually ever going to reach out to them. So there's a real element of uncertainty, and some of the egg donors we spoke to were very sort of, it was part of their kind of imaginary of saying, I wonder if I will ever meet this family, will I ever meet this woman, sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And what we see in terms of the project that Nicky and I have been involved in recently about how DNA testing comes and kind of impacts on donor conception is that the kind of the relational questions that come up over time can be really quite significant. And we don't, as a society, we don't really know how a donor or an egg donor might relate to a child or an adult who's now 25. It's not their mother, but there is a connection. And those relational challenges isn't just in terms of that connection, but it can also be to your own family, especially if you've kept it secret all those years. So in terms of time, this is a big question. And I think it's really important to get the relational side recognised there.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back to the international element here. Has there been any work done on the numbers of women that leave the UK to go and donate their eggs in a much more commercial system? For example, in America, you can get paid up to $20,000 for your eggs. I've just seen some adverts in Craigslist for $40,000 advertising, which is, even with the travel, even with the 2 weeks, possibly longer, with the treatments to be able to donate eggs, actually that is a financially attractive package for many people who are struggling. Has there been any work done on that?
There's been research on donors moving around internationally in order to donate, but nothing from the UK. So we don't have any evidence that there are women, that I'm aware of women moving from the UK abroad to donate. Mostly that is people that are moving. There's a little bit of research about people going to South Africa, a little bit of research around people going to the States. But none of those donors are from the UK. It's not something I've come across either. I've not heard in any of the research that I've done of people going abroad to donate eggs.
Okay. And do you think that there would be a willingness in terms of the international community to be able to tackle any problems that we see arising from this? Are there counterparts in the US, for example, that are raising these concerns around the commercialisation of egg donation? Or not? Or is it just become so kind of part of the culture and it's very different to ours in that respect?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So it's like in Europe, I think there is quite a lot of like collaboration and also with the Oviedo Convention. Like there are all these conventions that regulate how we treat biomaterials, and I think it's a very sound framework. The problem with the US is I think that it's not just about egg donation, it's about everything. So you put like surrogacy, IVF, like all of it is extremely inflated and commercialized. And I mean, I don't have enough geopolitical knowledge to know whether they would be willing to collaborate, but it's a much broader issue than just egg donation. So I'm quite pessimistic about this.
I can answer your question from the other side, because we have a lot of American patients that choose to come to our clinic because of how expensive it is. And I get a lot of feedback from them, if they've certainly had a cycle in America, about how they're just treated like a conveyor belt and it's just a business and they don't have any kind of interaction with their doctor. So there's a lot of that going on. So I think, especially when you've got a situation like you said, where I thought it was around 20,000, but you found an advert for 40,000 for, I mean, it's just so much money, so it just completely sways the motives from an altruistic model to the potential for exploitation. So it's a totally different system there, and I don't think there'd be much appetite from their side for collaboration at all. No.
Okay, thank you very much. Didn't want to make assumptions, but I think it's worth noting that if you are yourselves reporting that you're not finding people coming forward because of financial reasons, doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't finding other ways for it. We have heard horrific stories in this committee, but also, as I'd say, probably politicians within our inbox, of women having to go to extraordinary lengths to make ends meet or to keep a roof above their heads. what you have described for that 2 weeks, although invasive and probably sometimes quite unpleasant, no matter how comfortable you try to make them, actually is a drop in the ocean compared to what many women are willing to go through to make ends meet. So I'm just going to hand over to Kim now.
Lovely. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everybody, for coming this afternoon. It's been really interesting. Like David, this is a subject I don't know a huge amount about, so it's been really, really helpful. Just a bit of a heads up, a bell may ring shortly.
Yes.
And like Pavlov's dogs, us MPs will have to go and vote. It's not personal. So if that happens, I apologise, and I assume we'll come back. So we're going to come on to egg freezing now. So, Giulia, I'm going to ask you first of all, if I can, why do women typically freeze their eggs? What are the considerations that women are making when they're making that decision, in your experience?
Yeah, thanks. So, great question again. So, I know in the press there has been a lot of emphasis on sort of people doing for career advancement reasons, so like postponing the time of conception in order to advance their career, and therefore freezing eggs as a sort of insurance against future fertility loss because of that. In practice, systematically, in all the studies I've looked at, there is like the main reasons. So that's almost never a reason. And actually, this is quite consistent both in the studies but also across meta-reviews, so meta-reviews of many studies. The most common reasons are lack of suitable partner at the moment, in a certain point in time where they would want to have children or they see children in the near future. Something called panic partnering, so sort of getting together with somebody in order just to have children, so avoiding that, so which is related to the lack of partner. And then obviously a desire for biological motherhood. And the fourth is running out of time and the related wishing to have a backup plan. So these are consistently, and I've re-reviewed all the studies in the last few days, consistently the reasons that are the most common reason to freeze eggs. I think I'll stop.
Timothy, do you want to add anything? Because this is your area as well, isn't it?
I mean, I'm pleased, but there's still a long way to go of what's happening over the last few years, whereas I published an article a few years back where women were really doing it too late, freezing their eggs. Kind of the majority were doing it 75% of that time back in 2018 when they're 38 or older. And that's shifting a lot. So somehow there's a lot of work still to do on it. We're getting the public message out there more and more. But it all stems from the very unfair biological clock, frankly.
Tell me about
it. So more and more women now, so look at HFEA data, 40% were under the age of 35. So still 60% over the age of 35, which is the ideal age to do it, is on 35 and under from scientific studies out there. But more and more people are doing it as an informed choice to try and essentially not have involuntary childlessness or need a donor egg in the future.
Okay, that's really interesting. And is there a role around workplace cultures or benefits around this? So if there's any sort of employer-funded freezing programme or anything like that, does that have an impact as well? Go on, Giulia.
Yeah, so thanks. So in terms of like benefits, so the first companies who sort of made this a thing were like Apple and Facebook, or already like more than 10 years ago, I think. And now it becomes more and more common in the package of benefits offered by various companies. So there is one worry is the following. So one worry is when companies are suggesting this, when companies are offering, it might be that people feel pressure to make use of these benefits, but actually there is very little evidence that this is the case. And in practice, egg freezing is very costly, and so in a sense, companies offering them, it's true that there could be some pressure, but there is little to no, there is basically no evidence that I could find on that. At the same time, like many women could do it because it's part of the benefits package. So I think, unfortunately, because women maybe are let down in other ways by the public sector, this is a sort of like way to address some of these issues. Now, I think it's not the right way. So I think the right way would be providing better care in the sort of public sector or making it part of a comprehensive package for fertility care. But it's a sort of something that happens in between. Now, last thing on the company benefits. So I think like with company benefits is there are lots of benefits that are offered by companies that are in this sphere. So I know that egg freezing gets a lot of press, but for example, some companies are including IVF for the first time. Some companies, not just in the UK, but across the globe, are also including sort of the hormones necessary to transition. So there are like various benefits around medical issues. It's not just egg freezing. And I think egg freezing falls between the sort of medical type packages, but also in the sort of like benefits related to family. So there are, for example, we wouldn't think that a company offering sort of subsidized nursery would be objectionable, would do something objectionable, but we worry about egg freezing. I don't have a settled view on either of them, but I think we shouldn't single out egg freezing as the only thing that companies do in this space.
Okay. Anybody want to add anything? Timothy, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much in favour of it. And when it first came out, like I said, about 10 years or so ago, is when I just started in fertility, and I was a bit sceptical. Or okay, why are the companies offering that? But actually, the reason they are is because their employees want that package. They want that, and they're the ones who are driving it. And you can see that very clearly as a doctor who treats a lot of women with egg freezing. The women who are having it paid for by their insurance through work are a lot happier than the ones who are paying for it themselves. Yeah. And then personal experience, when I often give talks in the city to companies for telling them about fertility treatment. If that company doesn't have an egg freezing package, I know what most of the questions are going to be for that, and afterwards, which is women then saying, why can't we have egg freezing? And to a point where when I went back, I was told to remove those slides for the next talk on egg freezing. So companies are being more and more encouraged to do it, and it's coming from their own employees, and not the other way around.
I have no idea.
A cycle of egg freezing is about £5,000.
So this is. Can we talk a second about the cost? Because So is there a specific question on the cost of egg freezing and IVF?
No, I don't think there is.
Okay, so I think this is quite important for what the work that this committee is doing. So first of all, there is the issue of like transparency in prices. So many agencies or companies that offer egg freezing have their prices on the website, but the prices often only shows the cost of the cycle, and then there is a separate price for the medication because depending on the patient, they will need different medications, and the price of medication varies so much. So like, for example, a cycle without medication, just investigation, egg retrieval, everything could cost between £2,000 and £4,000, but then this is just a cycle without the medication, but the medication could cost between, £1,000 and £5,000. So the variation in prices is huge. Like, there is a huge variation in terms of the price. And so I think like with sort of like how we are seeing this, so first of all, there is the issue of transparency, but also maybe this committee, I don't know if I can suggest this, but could explore also ideas of price caps. Because obviously the NHS has a system where all the prices are reviewed in a certain way, but the private sector, there are baseline regulations, but the companies can charge very different amounts for the same cycle. So I think it's interesting because with the benefit system, you don't have to worry about that, which means you all in the sort of workplace benefit, which also means you can choose the clinic you might want, and you sort of don't have to worry about whether medication is too expensive. You could just trust the doctor, but at the same time, the doctor might have an incentive to charge more because of the benefits. So it's quite complicated.
Alex has got a follow-up question. Do you want to do that now?
I just wanted to ask whether you think NHS funding should be more widely available for egg freezing. For example, particularly with women who have fertility problems, which might affect. Medical conditions which might affect their fertility.
Yeah, so again, this is like something I talk a lot about in my research. So currently, egg freezing is only paid or covered by the NHS if it's called medical egg freezing. So if somebody is if I'm saying something redundant, you can stop me, but just how it works. If somebody has to, for example, undergo chemotherapy or any fertility sort of affecting therapy, then patients are offered the option to freeze their eggs and sperm on the NHS. If somebody does it for purely social reasons, which include, for example, lack of a suitable partner, but also maybe this sort of in-between cases like you described, for example, endometriosis, is not the same as a therapy that will definitely impair fertility. It's more something that makes it more difficult. So there are these three sorts of cases, but only the first, so only the undergoing chemotherapy or anything like that is covered. And the only country that doesn't have this distinction is France, and it's only since 2 years. So across the world, actually, the medical egg freezing, if it's paid, then is often only paid for, whereas the rest is not. So now back to the question you asked me. So I think personally there are good reasons to explore egg freezing as a sort of broader fertility care that countries offer, because I don't think there is such a substantive difference between medical and social egg freezing. Both sets of women freeze their eggs to ensure against future fertility loss. There might be different reasons, but I don't think they are sufficiently different to warrant the sort of distinction. With polycystic ovarian syndrome and endometriosis, I think is even more compelling, because we already know that these women will struggle in the future. So again, the difference between what is medical and these other sort of categories is even thinner or more loose or something like that. Thanks.
Thank you, Kim.
Does anybody want to add anything to that? Nicky, do you want to
Just to add to that, I think the wider problem here is the lack of NHS funding for any kind of fertility treatment. So even if that were funded, then you've still got the problem of people being able to return to have the IVF treatment in order to use the eggs. So it's part of a bigger picture of a lack of IVF funding more generally, I think.
Yeah, and
in the
Petra,
NHS.
Yeah, I mean, NHS funding for general fertility treatment is a bit of a mess and a postcode lottery, frankly, at the moment. We've got some CCGs offering nothing, some offer 3 cycles, most, about over 80% now, just offering 1 cycle. So when you've got such a discrepancy there, and the NHS has only been reducing that over the last decades, it's only coming down, it's not going up. I mean, in a perfect world, I'd absolutely love every woman who wanted to have egg freezing do it for social reasons and not have to pay, but it's just an unrealistic dream, frankly, that the NHS would be able to afford that.
That's really helpful. Petra, did you want to add anything?
No, I'm just fascinated because it's not my area of research, but as a sociologist I can't help but find this incredibly fascinating. And also colleagues of mine who do research on women who don't have children because they simply cannot afford to have them, full stop. So it's a very strange place where we discuss, how can women delay childbirth, when actually many women can't even afford to think about it.
Yeah, no, really interesting. New project coming up. So, and final one from me. What's known about the success rate of egg freezing in terms of live birth outcomes? And is there enough data collection on that? And if not, why not? I'll go to you, Giulia, again, first of all.
Yeah, great, thanks. Great question again. So there is quite a lot of knowledge that comes from IVF, because egg freezing is just the first steps of many IVF cycles. So usually you do all this, and so you go through all the things that Tim described for donors. It's the same for egg freezing, it's the same for sort of IVF with your own eggs. And so then the success rates are IVF success rates. So basically what we know is that there is a certain number of eggs that are collected and then they are collected. Not all of them are frozen because they are not mature, they're called. And so let's say only 70% more or less will be mature and so will be frozen. Of these 70%, only about 50% survive thawing, so being defrosted basically. And then only some of them will reach the 6 days to be implanted, and only some of the implanted embryos will develop into a fetus and then have so that there is a live birth. So basically it goes down quite a lot. So if you have, 20 eggs, the sort of chances of success for one viable pregnancy are around 70%. This is the sort of numbers. And there is quite a lot of data on that, and companies have that on their website. The problem is that it's very dependent on many other factors. For example, it can be, many people freeze their eggs, not their fertilized eggs, so it depends how your partner will be once you decide to fertilize them. It might be that they have male factor infertility, or it might be that there are other complications. So the problem with the success rates of egg freezing is that we know that there is a certain number that increases the likelihood of having a live birth, but it's hard to actually assess whether those specific eggs will develop can develop into embryos and then fetuses just because of all the steps that are involved in the process. So we know estimates and percentages, but it varies a lot patient to patient. So it's quite difficult because on the one end, we want to give this data to the people who need to decide whether or want to decide whether to freeze or not. But I think it's important to emphasize that it can be that you have super high chances and you have 0 live birth, and this is the case for IVF also. So it's complicated.
Yeah, brilliant. Anybody else want to add anything to
that?
Yeah,
it's a really, really important question. I think this is one thing that the committee could really help with in terms of transparency of data for egg freezing. Because, for example, a patient can go to this beautiful boutique clinic in London and freeze their eggs, and that clinic has never had a live birth from someone who's frozen their eggs, potentially. So when patients as well, when I'm giving educational talks, are kind of overwhelmed by, okay, there's so many clinics in London, for example, how do I choose which one to go to? And the two really important things that clinics should be transparent about in terms of their data is, what is your freeze-thaw survival of the egg? Because I like to think as a doctor I'm important, but it's your lab, the embryology team, who are freezing and thawing the eggs that are so important, because the technique and experience with doing that really improves the outcome significantly. So you want to know that clinic's numbers there, and also how many patients have you had who's come back and used the eggs, and what is your clinic's data for 8 different age groups with women who, when they froze, and what their ultimate success rate is when they've come back. So not publications, but that clinic's data, and that's what should be more transparent. And when patients ask me, what do I need to know? I said these are the two most important things, and then obviously I present them with what our clinic's data are, and I think that helps the patients a lot choose.
Yeah. More transparency around success rates, and possibly again more transparency around the costs.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is where the CMA has really helped, because since working with clinics, it's one of the big things that they've done. And for example, I think it's really, like you said, really important not just to say this is a cycle cost of egg freezing, but of course they need medication. So you have to say this is the dose I'm going to give you, this is how much it's going to cost, and then they get a total, as opposed to being, oh wow, that's really cheap, but then at the end of the day they're still paying much more. Patient experience, that's very, very important. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kim. Before that bell goes, and I keep looking over there because I can see the Minister is on their feet, which means that votes will be imminent. Professor Nicky Hudson, I want to say before we go and vote, thank you very much, because I know that you will be having to leave at 4:00 for a speaking engagement, which will probably be it will be before we come back to from the chamber. So I wanted to say thank you on behalf of the committee. Before we go on to that, the thing I wanted to ask around egg freezing, is there genetic screening before any of the eggs are frozen, or when no?
You can't, because the egg is a single cell. So if you did a genetic test, you've taken the nucleus out
on the donor themselves. To screen for any illnesses or anything.
Or for an egg donor?
Yeah, for an egg donor.
Yes, there's extensive screening that's
extensive screening. Yeah. And should somebody, donor, come forward and finds out something that they didn't know about themselves, what kind of support is there for them following that Petra?
I don't know that I'm the right person to answer that.
No, Nicky?
This is a gap, actually. It's another project that I'm working on at the moment on expanded carrier screening for donors, and for people who aren't using donation but are having fertility treatment themselves. And actually, so we're moving into a space where clinics are increasingly screening donors for a range of genetic conditions at the point at which they donate. There's not a huge amount of that going on in the UK. It primarily happens when we import sperm, and the sperm has been tested because it's come from a country and so people are being screened, recipients are being screened. But it's another area where we're moving into that space. So very few clinics, although there are a few in the UK that are starting to offer that for donors. And actually there is a little bit of a gap, because most fertility clinics don't have trained clinical geneticists that work within the clinic to be able to counsel donors if something comes up in their kind of genetic history or genetic profile. But part of the story here is that we're all carriers of something, so it's part of the story that people are given when they are donating their gametes. But it is an area where we don't have a full picture in terms of the implications of donors, again, long term, or what that might mean for their own reproductive planning if something comes up in their kind of genetic profile, what that might mean then for their partnership decision making and having children down the line. So it's something else that's on the horizon, I think, in the UK.
What could be done better to support that? Are there any international examples where they are doing it well, for example?
Yeah, internationally, there are countries that are rolling this programme out more generally in the healthcare system. So Australia, Belgium are trialling it. Okay. So yeah, there are countries in which that is happening more generally, not just for donors, that we could probably learn from.
Thank you very much. I'm going to suspend the sitting while we go and vote. Yeah. Thank you very much. Order.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the Women and Equalities Select Committee. We'll resume our sitting following vote, and I hand straight over to Kevin to talk about psychological considerations.
Thank you, Chair. I'd love to explore some of the psychological considerations around egg freezing and egg donation. So the real question, I think, actually probably to Giulia in the first instance, really, is, well, what are they? What, from your point of view, what are the psychological impacts of egg donation freezing that have actually been identified, and how does that reflect your experience?
Yeah, thanks. If that's okay, sorry to be, I hope it's not rude. I would like to start with Nicky for egg donation, especially because you might need to go, and then I maybe talk about egg freezing.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Nicky and Petra probably.
Yeah, we can both speak to that. Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
So most of the evidence of that relates to the psychological impact of egg donation particularly suggests that there isn't a huge negative impact on donors, and there aren't huge numbers of donors who regret donation, for example. But there is some evidence that people would have liked the process of egg donation to kind of happen in a slightly different way, shall we say. And I think this relates to the kind of issues that we spoke to earlier about how things could be improved from donor perspective, perhaps making the care that people receive more donor-centric. So that one of the things that people say is they don't realise how long it's going to take, and so they wish they'd known that at the start. And again, this goes back to what people are told and the information that people are given. There are some studies that show that people have regret in relationship to knowledge about the outcomes of the donation in contexts where donors are anonymous primarily. So that doesn't necessarily tend to relate in the context of ID release donation. So we don't hear that from donors, and certainly not in the research that we've done with ID release donors where they have regret about that. They've thought very carefully about the implications. They've received implications counselling. They know that somebody potentially might contact them. So the research that shows that they may have regret around the potential for connection is usually in anonymous contexts where people have donated as an anonymous donor and then wish they had more information about the potential offspring. Most of the donors that we spoke to in our research described having thought long and hard about the process, often over years, where in some cases they'd wanted to fulfil having their own families before making that decision to donate. And so they were kind of well aware at the point of donation, of the implications. I don't think you can ever capture everything. People look back retrospectively of things that they've done and decisions that they made and might think differently. This isn't a static process. But on the whole, the evidence that we've got suggests that people are broadly satisfied, that they don't necessarily have lots of concerns or regret about the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Our studies echo that as well, that it's very rare that people regret having donated. In fact, as I said before, it's something they're very proud of. Most of the women in the major study that I was involved in were looking back at having acted as an egg donor. So the average time at which people acted as egg donors was in 2014, and we interviewed them 4 or 5 years later. So they had time to reflect. And like Nicky said, I think that overarchingly it was very positive experiences, and where there were negative experiences, they were often associated with a sense of a lack of aftercare from the clinic. That was almost the only negative aspect that sort of came up, that they didn't feel looked after properly, or that they were sort of critical. Some of them were critical that if they did need medical care, the clinic wasn't the one to pick up the bill for that. It was the NHS to pick up the bill. So there were some critical notes on that. And I think along that sort of line of thought as well, where people were critical, was that they were doing this as an altruistic gesture for another woman or another family to have a baby, and they didn't want particularly more money for that, but they were critical of just how much clinics were charging for their services. So that was that were the sort of issues. I suppose also in terms of broader psychological or sort of relational impact, I think that the long-term consequences perhaps in terms of how do you talk about egg donation to your own family? Do you tell your own children? In the law currently, there is no recognition of donor's own family. So donors' own children don't have access for something like the donor-sibling link. They can't sign up to that. They're not sort of recognised even though they are as genetically related as donor siblings would be. So there is a sort of lack, I think, of recognising donors as full humans with families of their own who may well feel quite impacted by the donation and the relational impact that might come down the line for them.
Thanks. Yeah, and sorry again to push back on that. So, okay, now to
I like assertiveness, is actually
okay. so to egg freezing. So there are two things that are often talked about in studies, and there has been a lot of bad press and then studies countering that, but I'm going to make the case that this is important. So the two of the positive effects of psychological implication of egg freezing are connected to empowerment and a sense of security. The sort of, not in terms of like, I'm for sure gonna have a baby, because I don't think that women are as naive as sometimes they are portrayed in the media, but more like, I've done something that can help me in the future, even if it might not work. So an empowerment is something similar in terms of like, oh, I did that for myself, even if I don't have a partner, even if now, like, this is my thing. And these two things get a lot of bad press, both in the media and in academic research and papers, because because some people are saying, and I think they're not completely wrong, but they're also not right. So they're saying, well, it's not very empowering because you're just going in line with social norms that tells you that you should have babies, or it's not correct to have a sense of security because this might not work. But I think this is a simplification of the psychological effects and the also of choices that women make. So I think these are two positive outcomes of doing it. Now, on the negative outcomes, so this again, both from my research, and this is not from my experiences, I can talk about it, but this is just more in general, the picture, which I think is more important, more representative. So there is this thing whereby people might go into IVF and egg freezing thinking, oh, I'm just going to do this and it's going to be okay, I will have a sufficient amount of eggs and so on. The problem is that sometimes you don't have the results that you expect. So, for example, your ovarian reserve might be lower than you think, you might get fewer eggs than you were hoping, all sorts. So this is something that then generates a cycle whereby somebody who wasn't worried about their fertility before becomes really worried about. So it's sometimes called the fertility treadmill in research. I think one way to counter this is giving like very reliable information at the start. So obviously somebody can't say the exact number of eggs that will be retrieved or collected, but somebody could say, look, this is the average, and emphasizing that it could be that you are one of the unlucky patients. So I think that's very important, but the problem is that there is a tension between the commercial interests of companies to like sort of provide this service, even with the best intention, and the sort of need to keep expectation low. So that's a tension that also affects the psychology of people who freeze their eggs. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think just exploring the support that's then available to women and anyone with them, really. I mean, what's the variation in the provision of counselling services in clinics?
It does vary. I believe some clinics are, potentially charging patients for certain. I mean, I'm not talking about donors, but for if a standard fertility patient wanted to have some counselling, some clinics charge for that, and I don't believe that's right. I don't think they should. I think that should be sorted up as part of the fertility treatment cycle overall. The HFEA Code of Practice is very clear that all donors should have and should see, and strongly encourages them to see a counsellor, and also mentions for egg freezing patients, because they're a potentially vulnerable group as well, that they should have access to it, and it shouldn't be limited to one session.
So they're saying it should be, but is it mandated, stipulated? Have clinics got a way around that? Sounds like there's variation.
I mean, we would strongly recommend all of our egg donors to see a counsellor and be reluctant to put them through if they didn't do that, but it's not 100% compulsory.
Yeah, I think clinics have to offer one session, but yeah, whether they actually enforce that, I think is a different question. I think also what that session might contain is a huge variation in terms of how that counselling actually kind of pans out. I think also there's a real lack of follow-up care and counselling that people are able to access over time, and not just egg donors, but so for example, egg donors who might have donated anonymously under a contract of anonymity, and then either, I found through DNA testing, and they suddenly have to kind of think about, well, what do I do now? This is not the situation I thought I was in, but I do have, and it can raise a lot of questions, not just in terms of contact with the donor-conceived person, but also with one's own children, how are they going to feel about this existence of this other child? And that's where there is no support. Or certainly one of the places where there just isn't freely available support.
And is there enough evidence just from the experiences that women have to say what good should look like in terms of counselling? What should the offer be?
Well, I think freely available. If it would cost a huge amount of money, then that's going to prevent people from accessing the kinds of support they might want.
I think what Petra's saying is really, really, really important there, that it shouldn't be, okay, they've completed their treatment, but you no longer are a patient of ours, you no longer have access to the counselling. It should be a constant, it doesn't matter if it's years later.
Nicky, I know you were...
Yeah, it's something we published from our research actually with UK egg donors on their experience specifically of counselling, and it's a long-standing issue I think in the UK fertility sector in terms of the quality and availability of counselling generally, and I think this is an area where this committee could have an impact, because we are seeing some clinics rolling back from making counselling sessions mandatory for donors, because it's not in the guidance. It is only the offer, not the mandating the session. And so the donors in our study, the kinds of counselling they liked and felt positively about were counselling where they were offered a new space to explore considerations around counselling that they hadn't considered themselves previously, and also that it was tailored to their situation, because there are so many different scenarios in which somebody can donate an egg. As we've heard, it could be ID release, it could be known, and it could be in the context of surrogacy. So the counselling needs to be tailored to that situation. And unhelpful counselling was where people felt that the counselling was overly negative, that they were feeling judged or assessed, or where they felt the counselling was unnecessary because it was telling them things they already knew. So there is a bit of evidence now about how that can be done in a kind of more positive way.
And is there evidence around the different psychological needs, or maybe the different types of counselling that's required for different demographic groups, whether it's age, sexual orientation, actually, I'm thinking particularly neurodivergence as well?
No, but I think counselling, if you had a counsellor sitting here, they would probably say that good counselling should be tailored to the person sitting in front of them. So it should be sort of person-centred, and so therefore, that arises from that encounter, and good counselling should encapsulate that, should kind of meet the person where they are and so on. I'm not a counsellor, but I think the guidelines around counselling would kind of fulfil that.
I think we've talked about some of the longer term impacts and potentially in the future as well, unless anyone's got anything they wanted to add on that, way beyond the actual process of the donation down the line.
I mean, I think what we're seeing in terms of the study that we've done, where people either do their own DNA testing because they're interested, or they are, it just happens to them because a relative of theirs had done a DNA test. So they didn't actually mean to be contactable, but there you are, it's happening. And actually navigating those connections that might emerge from that is incredibly complicated, partly because we don't, as a culture, we don't really know how we're meant to be doing that. And so lots of our research, qualitative data, are people saying there is no guidebook, I'm not sure what I'm meant to be doing, how do I relate to these people? They're very, very tentative encounters. And that they could really be really beneficial, I think, with some guidance on what to expect in terms of closeness or distance to those people, what to expect in terms of going forward with people you're connected with in that sort of way.
Should there be a long-term duty of care on the clinics offering the service?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So just quickly, for egg freezing, there is no mandatory, but also it's always, I think, I haven't seen any clinic that doesn't offer it, that offers it as part of a package. So it's a sort of additional cost. I might be wrong, but I checked.
We don't charge any of our fertility patients for any counselling.
For egg freezing.
Any fertility patient, egg freezer. Or
so because I checked, and then you must be a big outlier, because most of the clinics actually offer it as a separate thing. Yeah. Are you aware of this? Okay. So I think more than before, I think it would be be important to do it afterwards. So like, and this, again, I might be wrong, apparently I'm wrong about this clinic, but afterwards, after egg retrieval, it would be good to check how the patient feels. But I don't, and I'm actually uncertain, there is no sort of mandated session after egg retrieval, but considering there could be a very disappointing result, I think it would be an area that is very important.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Christine.
Thank you. I should probably refer you to my register of interest before I say anything, but something, Giulia, that you said prompted me to think about the health implications, which we're going to talk about egg donation. You talked about retrieval and a woman not having the same reserve of eggs.
Yeah.
What do we know? I know IVF and egg retrieval is now half a century old. We know an awful lot about it. But what do we know about the short and long-term physical impacts on things like a woman's ability to have children later in life if she has donated earlier on, as well as the implications of the IVF itself and the egg retrieval?
Yeah, good, thanks. I'm going to just quickly say something, or do you want to start, Tim? I know you're
I don't mind.
The answer is we've got a huge amount of data to answer that question. Short term, the risks I talked about earlier are very well known of the process, but and it's been honed over the years, and the patients are so monitored so closely in terms of scans and blood tests during that process that we have got it very, very safe. Of course, we're always striving to never have a complication, but that's an unrealistic dream. But a significant complication is well below 1% of all cycles started now nationally. Long term, we've got a huge number of very large population cohort studies that followed women up for decades, looking at things like early menopause, all female cancers, and the vast majority of those studies are showing no increase in incidence of those cancers. So the data is really, really reassuring.
This is maybe going into too deep, but what percentage of the women who have been through the process and have been through egg retrieval, etc., what percentage of them do you actually have, if you like, track of? How many keep in touch? How many let you know? I mean, how big is that database per capita, if you like?
Well, this was a database on, I think the most of the ways those studies are done is looking at cancers and then tracking back those patients' histories. So I'm talking about published medical studies, not, for example, my own follow-up. But you're right. Once the clinic, because hopefully the patients had the baby and they've completed their family, they often keep in touch and send nice emails and stuff. But you're not tracking their medical history. You're not their GP.
Okay. Anyone else? Giulia?
No, actually, yeah.
Do you think there's a lack of long-term studies on the impact of egg donation on donors physically? In health terms, we've talked about the psychological impact, but the health terms.
So, it's not my area, so maybe you might be a better place. But basically, there are longitudinal studies, again, on publicly available records. So the idea is like sort of psychological outcomes and sort of compared to the general population, and then comparing at donors seems to be, as Petra was saying, positive on the short term and not a lot of data on the long term. But it's also something quite new because the law on sort of anonymity didn't change that long time ago. So I think there is scope for more studies on the long-term psychological effect post changing the law, if that makes sense. I think that's what I wanted to say.
I mean, in terms of you mentioned physical, but an egg donor is going through exactly the same treatment, whether it's an egg freeze patient or a standard IVF patient. So therefore, that data is completely transferable to someone who's donated their eggs. I completely agree there's a gap in research in terms of long-term. Short-term, there's a lot, but long-term psychological impact. And especially in a country like the UK now, where it's only been a few years after 18 years from that legislation change, where I'm not aware of any UK study where I mean, if we looked at what's the outcomes when those donor-conceived offspring have made contact with the donors and how the donors are feeling, how that's affected them. So I think that's a big gap at the moment and a real call for research.
Petra, did you have anything to add on the physical health aspects?
Not on the physical health aspects. I absolutely agree that the long-term relational, psychological impact is very understudied, especially I think as a field we are moving towards where so people even before DNA testing, people were egg donors were encouraged by clinics to not post on social media about where they had donated, what time, their donor number and so on, in order to not be tracked. But social media makes that very possible. And with DNA testing added into that, people are very, very traceable these days. So the promise of anonymity that we still sort of offer donors isn't really a realistic option. And the people who we've interviewed in terms of DNA testing, sort of many feel like DNA testing is their only option, whether they like to do it or not, because they find the legislative framework very restrictive. And so it kind of, people they do the roundabout route in order to avoid the formal system. So I think it's very much it's very much opening up as a field where the contact between people connected through donation is very much on the horizon.
Given what you've all said about, and I'll mispronounce this, longitudinal studies, the psychological impact and also the health impact, do you think that clinics can be confident that they are obtaining informed consent with this lack of longitudinal research and impact, and now the anonymity aspect? Can you be sure that the consent is completely informed?
So I'm just gonna take the first part, and then so I think we egg donation. So there are two questions. So one is the sort of physical health, even if the distinction is a bit wishy-washy, but physical health. And as Tim was saying, there is a lot of evidence just because it's the same process as IVF. And I think I read in the submitted evidence that some people were complaining about the lack of studies for egg freezing and egg donation, but there shouldn't need specific study for that, considering that this is the exact same process that just gets truncated with egg freezing and changes with egg donation. So on the sort of long-term health impact, I think we're safe on the sort of consent side of things. On the psychological, I think this is more a question of making people aware, not just of the sort of research that might be done and the results of that research on long-term psychological effects, but sort of informing and making people reflect on whether they would be okay with being contacted, so I think in a sense it doesn't really matter if there is a lot of research saying some people regret it, some people not, because I think the important thing is the person you have in front of you now when it comes to informed consent. So ensuring that it's properly informed in the sense that they are aware of the consequences rather than, 5% of people might regret their decision. Does this make sense? So the sort of difference between the person you have in front of you now and the sort of general data on the population that has done it, something like that.
Yeah, despite the lack of longitudinal data, the consent is definitely informed because you're telling the patients all of these things and they're making that decision, verbally, in extensive medical consultations and counselling, which is, as I said, strongly encouraged. And things like the direct-to-consumer genetic testing are absolutely mentioned as a fundamental part of that. So if they accept that this is a possibility, that even before the child's turned 18, that I could get this random contact, and you've explained that to them, and they decide to go ahead with the treatment, whether that affects them in the future negatively is irrelevant to them giving their consent at that point in time.
I think if I could just also add that I think it has changed dramatically. What donation means has changed dramatically over the last 20 or 30, 40 years. So whereas parents used to be encouraged to go home and keep it a secret in the 1970s and 80s and forget about it and keep it secret from the donor-conceived person, we have shifted as a society towards much more openness. So it's difficult to consent for something in the 1990s when we're in 2026 we're looking at a completely different picture. We have new technologies, we have social media, the world has changed. So you know, it's a sort of moving picture, really.
One last thing, and I think we might have covered this, is the aftercare provided to women after egg donation and freezing by clinics. Are you all confident that it's sufficient?
I think nationally, in terms of clinics, it's something that's really, really important. It was a drive from the HFA on this over the last 5 to 10 years about the aftercare, especially for egg freeze patients, because obviously if it's a standard IVF couple and they've got pregnant, they've got a baby, they're very happy. If they haven't, they're going to book a follow-up appointment with you to probably try for more treatment or go to another clinic, so that their care is continuing. With egg freezing, you know, there was this sudden shut off where the patients kind of all out there on their own and don't have any appointment. So I think clinics should be offering, as part of the cycle package, you know, so essentially the cycle fee, they're not paying anything extra for a medical follow-up appointment with their consultant or doctor. And as part of that, I think it's important in those few days afterwards where the hormones are still raging, they might be in a bit of pain, the clinic gives them a phone call, and more clinics are doing that now, just to check in, how are you doing, don't forget to book the follow-up appointment, and I think that aftercare is extremely important.
Yeah, just to say that the evidence that we have is that it isn't always there. And I would very much agree with Tim that it needs to be there. And that when people did feel regretful or sort of negative about egg donation, it was particularly in relationship with the clinic and the lack of aftercare, the lack of concern.
Yeah, with egg freezing, most clinics offer a follow-up appointment or a phone consultation, and they check in after a few days just to check their health. Again, I checked. I think the thing is that the ones that for sure get properly looked after are the ones that are doing another cycle, whereas some people are like, okay, I'm fine, and they're not having the follow-up appointment. But I think it's on a need-based, so it's not great, but it's also not bad.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a quick question before we go. This is going to be relevant to our future panels. But in terms of aftercare, what happens and what redress do women have who have frozen their eggs should a clinic go bust or have harmed the embryos in a way that was not agreed upon when they donated or when they froze their eggs? Is there any protections for the people that have frozen their eggs at all?
Well, I'm not aware. Well, there hasn't been any situation in the history in the UK where a clinic's gone bust and the patients have all lost their embryos or eggs because the
Hudson Fertility Centre didn't have issues with freezing their eggs and they weren't banned because that's what they said in 2024.
What happened, sorry?
Hudson Fertility Centre.
Oh.
Yeah, they had an issue with not being able to thaw the eggs acceptably and were therefore...
Of course. So you talk about going bust. I was answering
there are. I mean, there is an element.
Of course, things can go wrong in the lab. And if that happens, then, for example, that clinic was closed down until what happened was sorted out by the HFEA.
But also, I think if these are a commercial clinic, there is also a chance that they could go bust, even if they haven't yet.
Yeah. So I mean, again, very important question. So part of it is in the consent form, so you are informed in terms of what the sort of like it can go wrong at the solving process, and this is more like I think an informed consent issue. Patient can move, or patient users, I don't know, can move their eggs from one clinic to the other. So there is this provision also regulated under overseen by the HFEA in terms of like moving eggs from one clinic to the other. So this hasn't happened, but this could be one potential solution. And often these clinics, this might change, but often these clinics are part of like groups of clinics rather than one clinic. So there is maybe some provision whereby if one goes bust, then the eggs can be moved across the same company. It might change, but this is the case at the moment. I'm thinking about that.
It's a good question. I'm not sure, and I don't want to guess, but I would imagine the HFEA would insist that every clinic has some provision that they have to have a plan in place if they are going out of business of what they do with those patients' embryos.
Okay.
And obviously, if that clinic is closing down, which it can do, it would have to have a provision in place before it completely shuts that all of the embryos have been moved to where the patient wants them to.
Okay.
I'm not sure of the exact, but I'm very confident that that's already in place.
Okay. Christine, just last
okay,
question.
I think actually Giulia covers it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that this is going to be a really interesting inquiry going onwards, and you've given us plenty to get stuck in to. So thank you very much. That brings this session to a close. Order, order.